Kunle Adebayo had spent 30 years sending money home, 30 years without missing a single month, 30 years believing that was enough to care for his parents. But one Tuesday morning, amidst invoices and contracts, his secretary placed a postcard on his desk, his mother's handwriting, shakier than usual. The message was normal, the usual questions, until the last line, 5 words Kunle and his mother had agreed upon when he was 12. A secret code that never, in 3 decades, had needed to be used. The homestead smells different. Kunle froze before that phrase, then shut everything down, grabbed his keys, and drove towards Ondo State without telling anyone, especially his brother. This story leaves us with 3 lessons more valuable than any inheritance. First, trust without vigilance destroys what love built. Music. Second, sending money does not replace being present. Third, music. True justice is built with patience, not with rage. Before you go, I need to tell you something important. 97% of the people watching this video will never receive the next one from me. It's not that I don't want to send it to them, it's that the algorithm only serves those who music are already subscribed. If you want to continue this journey with me, like, subscribe, and comment right now. That 3% will see them again in the next music video. You will be there. Kunle Adebayo had 52 years, a dark mustache, graying, and the hands of someone who had mixed cement long before learning to sign contracts. Now he signed contracts all day, but his hands were still the same, broad, calloused, with an old scar on his right index finger that reminded him of the first nail he'd hammered into himself at 16 on a construction site in Lagos. His office was on the 12th floor of a glass building in the Victoria Island area. Mahogany desk, leather chair, a view of the boulevard, things that 30 years ago he wouldn't have even imagined. Things he now looked at without seeing, because his head was always elsewhere on the plans for the new estate, on the cost of steel, on the delay of the waterproofing supplier who had been promising for 2 weeks and not delivering. On Monday mornings, he called his mother. It was a ritual he hadn't broken in 12 years. It didn't matter if he was in the middle of a meeting, at the airport, or driving on the highway. Music. At 10 inches the morning on Monday, he dialed the number of the homestead and waited for Mama Sade's voice. That Monday was like any other. "How are you, Mama?" "Fine, my son. Quiet here." Kunle waited a moment. Normally his mother would use that question to tell him 3 things at once. That the cow in the north paddock had calved, that Baba Jeed was having trouble with his knee again, that his father had argued with the fodder supplier. Mama Sade never just replied fine. Music. There was always something more. That Monday there was nothing more. And Baba? Fine. He's resting. Kunle looked at his watch. He had a meeting in 20 minutes. "Give him my regards. Do you need anything?" "No, my son. You already sent the deposit. That's enough." They hung up. Kunle held the phone for 3 seconds before the next call came in and the day swallowed him whole. At midday, he transferred the monthly deposit, 42,000 naira, to Coyote's account. As always, his younger brother had asked for this arrangement 2 years ago. "It's easier, brother. That way I handle the homestead expenses without going to the bank with Papa, who's already slower." Kunle hadn't questioned anything. Coyote was music. Coyote, who had stayed to care for their own land, while he went to build others. In the afternoon, between one call and another, music. Kunle opened the right drawer of his desk and took out a photo. He had kept it there for years, half hidden beneath some folders. It was a photo of the homestead, his father standing by the corral, his mother with her flowered apron, Coyote with a boyish smile. Kunle himself appeared in the background, younger, with the same scar on his finger, but without the mustache. Music. It had been 14 months since he had returned to Ondo State. There was always a reason, a project he couldn't leave, a contract to close, a week that turned into 2, then 4, and then another full year viewed from the 12th floor of a glass building. He put the photo away, drank his coffee, and went into the meeting. It was 5 inches the afternoon, when he was reviewing the last emails before leaving, that his secretary knocked on the door. "Sir, this arrived by traditional mail." She placed a small, cream-colored envelope with a stamp from the Owo local government area, Ondo State, on his desk. Kunle looked at it for a moment before opening it. Music. Nobody sent him letters. Nobody sent him anything by mail for years. He tore open the envelope with his finger and pulled out a postcard folded in 2. his mother's handwriting, shakier than usual. Kunle read the card twice. The front had an image of a cocoa farm in Ondo State, one of those postcards sold in artisan shops in Owo town center. The back had his mother's handwriting, cramped and small as always, but with a new tremor that Kunle didn't remember from other times. "My son, I hope you are well. The weather here is cool. Your father's blood pressure is a bit high, but the doctor says it's nothing serious. The chickens are laying well. Kayode and Folake take care of us. Don't worry about us. The homestead smells different." Kunle read that last line 3 times. The homestead smells different. 5 words that meant nothing extraordinary to anyone else reading that card. 5 words that for him meant everything. He was 12 years old when his mother taught him that code. It was an August afternoon, sitting on the veranda of the house, as the sun set behind the Ondo hills and the air smelled of wet earth. Mama Sade had held his hand with that firmness of hers, music, that didn't need to raise her voice to be felt. "Kunle, music, there are things that sometimes cannot be said directly," she had told him. "If one day I cannot speak clearly to you, if someone is listening, or if I cannot tell you the truth out loud, I will send you that signal. The homestead smells different. That means something is very wrong, and I need you to come without warning, without asking anyone. Just come." Kunle had nodded without fully understanding what that would be for one day. In 40 years, his mother had never used that phrase, until today. He carefully folded the card, put it in the inside pocket of his jacket near his chest, and stood up from the chair. Music. He didn't call his assistant. He didn't cancel the next day's meetings by phone. He grabbed his truck keys from the drawer, took his wallet, and walked out without saying anything to anyone. In the elevator, he dialed the homestead number. Kayode answered on the second ring. "Brother, what's up?" His brother's voice sounded exactly the same as always, calm, friendly, without a single crack. "Nothing," Kunle said. "Just calling to see how you all are." "All good here. Papa is asleep. Mama is watching her Yoruba movie. You know how old people are. They sleep early. It was 15 inches the afternoon." "That's good," Kunle said. "Music. Always take care of them, brother. That's what I'm here for." He hung up, went out to the parking lot, got in his truck, started the engine, and took the boulevard towards the Lagos-Akure Expressway. 3 hours on the road. Music. The sun was already setting. The city lights slowly faded behind until only the dark asphalt remained and his headlights cutting a path through the hills. Kunle didn't turn on the radio. Music. He didn't need music. He needed to think. His mother had never used that phrase in 40 years, and Kayode had answered the house phone at 5 inches the afternoon, saying his mother was watching her Yoruba movie, when Kunle knew, because he had heard it hundreds of times, that Mama Sade never watched television before 8 at night. What you've just heard teaches us that the alarm signals from those we love are almost always there. What fails is our attention. If this story is stirring something inside you, stay with us until the end. What's coming is even stronger. Has anyone close to you ever asked for help in a way you didn't understand in time? Tell us in the comments. Every story you share here gives strength to someone who doesn't know how to ask for help today. The highway at night has something that forces you to think. No traffic lights to interrupt. No horns. Music. No secretaries knocking on the door. Just the asphalt, the headlights, and the hum of the engine. Kunle knew that silence well. He had used it many times to solve construction problems, to calculate budgets in his head, to make decisions he didn't want to make in front of anyone. Tonight he used it to remember. He remembered the call 3 months ago when he asked his mother if she needed anything special for her birthday. Mama Sade had responded with a phrase that at the time seemed normal to him. "No, my son, I already have everything." But now, seen from the darkness of the highway, it sounded different. His mother always asked for something for her birthday. Always. As long as Kunle could remember, music. One year she asked for a blender, another year for rare yam seeds that could only be found in Benue. Another year she simply asked him to come visit her. She had never said, "I already have everything." He also remembered the photos. Kayode sent him photos of the homestead every month, the corrals, the cocoa trees, the Ondo sky. But in none of the last 8 did his parents appear. Music, Kunle had noticed and had written, "Send me a picture of the old folks, brother." Kayode responded with a photo of Pawale sitting in a chair on the veranda with his back turned, looking out at the farm. A single photo, from behind. He remembered that the last time he spoke to his father on the phone, Pawale cut the conversation short after 2 minutes, saying he was tired. His father never got tired of talking to him, never. Each memory was a small stone. Separately they weighed nothing. Together in the silence of that highway, they were a mountain. An hour before arriving, Kulle made a decision. He wasn't going to enter by the main path. The main path passed in front of Coyote's house before reaching the big house. The same path as always, the one everyone knew, the one that crunched with loose stones and announced from afar when someone arrived. Tonight he didn't want to announce. He knew another access, a bush track on the north side of the homestead, between the cocoa trees, used by the farmhands at harvest time. Narrow, unlit, but sufficient for the truck if he drove slowly. He reached the crossroads of the state highway past midnight, clear as throat. He turned off his headlights before turning onto the north track. He let his eyes adjust to the darkness and slowly drove between the rows of cocoa trees, which at that hour looked like still figures watching his passage. He parked the truck behind the old barn, about 200 meters from the big house, and got out in silence. The homestead at night smelled the same as always, earth, cocoa, the fresh air coming down from the hills. Kulle breathed deeply. That smell was the closest thing to his childhood he knew. He walked along the stone fence towards the main house. The veranda lights were off, but in his parents' bedroom window there was a faint glow, that of a small lamp, one his mother had left on all night since Kulle was a child. And in front of that window, from outside, there was a silhouette. It wasn't his father's silhouette, nor his mother's. It was someone taller, younger, standing with arms crossed, looking into the room, like someone watching, not someone caring. Kulle stopped in the darkness. He recognized the shape of the shoulders before recognizing the face. It was Coyote. Kulle remained motionless behind the stone fence. Coyote hadn't seen him. He was still standing in front of his parents' bedroom window, arms crossed and head slightly tilted inward, as if listening. After a moment, he turned around and walked back to his house, the small house about 50 meters from the big house, the one Kulle himself had helped build 15 years ago when Coyote married Folake. Kulle waited for the door of that house to close. Then he waited 5 more minutes. Then he walked to the main entrance of the big house. He took out the keys his father had always kept. He had never been asked to return them. It would never have occurred to him, music, and he opened the door without making a sound. Inside it smelled of a closed house, not dirt, not abandonment, but that specific smell of spaces that have been unventilated for a long time, where the air becomes still and thick, as if it too were waiting for something. He turned on the hallway light. He hadn't even taken a third step when he heard a noise behind him. He turned around. Coyote was in the main doorway, barefoot, in an old t-shirt, and his hair disheveled, as if he had run from his house as soon as he saw the light turn on. But he had a smile too wide for midnight, too quick to be genuine. "Brother," Coyote said and opened his arms. "What happened? Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" Kulle let him hug him. He returned the hug with the same strength as always, with the same pat on the back as always. He didn't let his arms say what his head already knew. "I left unexpectedly," Kulle said. "I just felt like seeing my parents." Of course, why not?" Coyote was still smiling. "But they're asleep already, aren't they? You'll see them well rested tomorrow morning, brother. I'll get the guest room ready for you now. I'm just going to greet them quickly. I won't wake them, just peep in." Coyote opened his mouth to say something else, but at that moment, Folake appeared in the hallway. She emerged from the shadows in a housecoat, and her hair tied back, too alert to be someone who had just woken up. Her eyes scanned Kulle from top to bottom in less than 2 seconds. A quick, almost clinical assessment. Then she smiled. "Brother-in-law, what a pleasure. Come in. I'll warm you up some dinner." "Thank you, Folake." Music. Later. Kulle was already walking down the hallway towards his parents' room. Coyote said something behind him, something about not startling them, that old people got easily surprised. But Kulle didn't stop. He put his hand on the doorknob. He noticed something before opening. The doorknob had a small metal eye screwed into the outside of the frame, recent. The paint around it still smelled new, the kind used for putting a padlock. At that moment there was no padlock, but the eye was there. He pushed the door. The room was dimly lit by the small lamp on the bedside table, the same lamp as always, with the yellow floral shade his mother had had since Kulle was a child. Music. The bed was neatly made, everything in order. And on the edge of the bed, sitting upright with his hands on his knees, was Pawale Adebayo, awake with his eyes open, staring at the opposite wall as if he had been doing so for hours. Kulle took a step inside. Pawale turned his head slowly, as if the movement cost him something. It took him 3 seconds to focus. 3 seconds that felt like 3 years to Kulle. Then the old man opened his mouth and said in a voice that sounded like dry earth, "You've arrived." Pawale didn't get up from the bed. That was the first thing Kulle noticed, and what cost him the most to process. His father was a man who stood up when someone entered the room, always. It was something he'd had since he was young, a habit that came from who knows where, but that Kulle had never seen broken. Pawale stood up to receive people. He stood up to bid them farewell. He stood up even if his knees hurt, and even if it was pouring rain outside. That night, he didn't stand up. Kulle slowly closed the door and approached. His father followed him with his eyes, those dark eyes that as a young man had been able to stop a farmhand 20 meters away with just a look. But something in them had changed. It wasn't old age, it wasn't sickness, music, it was something else. It was the dull glow of a man who had been unable to do anything for a long time. "Papa," Kulle said in a low voice. Pawale nodded once, slowly. Kulle sat on the edge of the bed next to his father, and for a moment both sat in silence looking at the same wall, like when Kulle was a child and his father would sit him beside him on the veranda without saying anything, just to be there. Only now the silence weighed differently. Kulle looked around the room carefully, without appearing to be searching for anything. The window had a new latch, the type that only opened from the outside. The wardrobe was locked, and the key was not in the room. On the bedside table, there was a glass of water, a pillbox, and a plate with 2 biscuits that no one had touched. On the floor, next to the bed, there was a plastic chamber pot that shouldn't have been there in a homestead that had a full bathroom, music, 10 steps from the room. Kulle breathed slowly through his nose. He counted to 3 silently. "How are you, Papa?" "Music." Pawale took his time to respond. When he did, his voice came out like water from a pipe that hasn't been used for a long time. First halting, then a little more fluid. "Here," he said, "just here." Kulle placed his hand over his father's. He felt the thick knuckles, the rough skin, the marked veins from so much work. Those hands had tamed horses, had driven stakes, had planted and harvested 200 acres for 40 years. Now they rested on his knees with nothing to do. "I shouldn't have let your brother," Pawale began, and stopped. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were still looking at the wall. "I thought he was trustworthy," he finally said in a voice so low that Kulle had to lean in to hear him. "He was always your brother, always family. I never imagined a man could do this to his own father." Kulle didn't respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew his father didn't need an answer. He needed someone to listen without interrupting, without judging, without telling him everything would be all right before he finished speaking. "Don't leave me alone in here, my son." That was all Pawale said. 8 words. The man who never asked for anything, who had weathered droughts and debts and bad years without asking anyone for help, had just asked. Kulle squeezed his father's hand with both of his and didn't let go. Then, from the wall of the next room, came 3 soft knocks. 1, 2, 3, spaced, precise, the same rhythm Mama Sade had taught Kulle 40 years ago, sitting on that same veranda the same afternoon she taught him the 5 words. "I'm here, come." Music. Kulle opened his mother's bedroom door with the same care with which he had opened his father's. Mama Sade was sitting on the right bed with her hands clasped in her lap. She wasn't asleep. She hadn't been asleep. Her eyes were open and fixed on the door, as if she had been waiting for exactly that moment for hours. When she saw her son, she didn't shout. She didn't cry. Music. She just slowly extended her arms. And when Kulle bent down to hug her, she grabbed his wrist with a strength that didn't match her size and whispered in his ear, so low it was almost just air. "Don't let go of my hand, my son, and don't believe anything your brother says." Kulle hugged her without saying anything. He felt what he had feared to feel, the bones more prominent, the body smaller, the weight of 8 months lived in a closed room. But his mother's eyes were still the same, clear, alert, music, without a single cloud of confusion. "How long have you been like this?" Kulle asked. 8 months. Mama Sade said it without hesitation, like someone who had counted every day. "At first they told us it was temporary, that Coyote was sorting out some papers for the homestead, and that he needed us to stay inside for a few days. so as not to complicate the paperwork. Your father believed them because he was his son. I believed them because I didn't want to think what I was thinking." She paused. She adjusted her hands in her lap. By the second month, no more paperwork, no more explanations, just the closed door, and Folake bringing food twice a day with a smile I wished I didn't have to see. My phone. Folake asked for it the first month. She said mine had a virus and she was going to take it to town to fix. She never returned it. Mama Sade looked at him directly. "That's why the postcard, my son. It took me 3 months to convince Babajai to post it. The poor man is afraid. His wife is sick. And Kayode threatened to fire him if he spoke. But in the end, conscience outweighed fear." Kunle listened to everything without interrupting. "And Papa?" Mama Sade looked down for a moment. "Your father knows everything, my son. That's why he doesn't talk much anymore." She paused for a long time. "When a man like your father cannot defend his own land, something inside breaks. And that cannot be fixed with medicine." We pause here for a moment to reflect. When an older person changes their way of speaking, stops asking for things, or no longer tells stories as before, it's not always age. Sometimes it's a closed door we haven't seen yet. When was the last time you visited your parents without warning? Now let's continue with the story. Kunle was processing every word when he heard steps in the hallway, slow, calculated, the kind someone makes who wants to listen without being heard. Mama Sade looked at him and squeezed his hand once. Quick, firm. Both fell silent at the same time, as if they had rehearsed that moment, as if in 8 months of a closed room she had learned exactly when to be quiet. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. Then, slowly, they moved away back down the hallway. Kunle didn't let go of his mother's hand. The Ondo sun rose slowly that morning, as if it too needed time to prepare. Kunle had been sitting on the veranda bench for an hour with cold coffee in his hands. He hadn't drunk it, just held it because having something in his fingers helped him think. He looked at the cocoa trees, the long, even rows, bluish-green under the morning light, and thought of his father, who had planted the first ones with his own hands 40 years ago. He thought of what his mother had told him the night before. He thought of the new eye screwed into the doorframe. Coyote appeared at 7 with a good morning smile and offered him yam and eggs. Kunle said he wasn't hungry. Coyote said he had to eat something. Kunle said later. Coyote stood there for a moment, assessing, measuring, and then went into the kitchen without saying anything else. Folake didn't come out. It was 8:30 when he heard quick, small footsteps crossing the dirt yard. Tunde came running from the small house with his school bag bouncing on his back and his shoelaces untied as always. 9 years old. Thin, with the same dark Adebayo eyes and a way of smiling that he hadn't yet learned to hide. "Uncle Kunle," he jumped straight into his arms without asking permission. "When did you arrive? Why didn't you wake me up last night?" Kunle hugged him and felt the child's light weight against his chest. That specific weight of children who don't yet carry anything. "I arrived late, champ. I didn't want to wake you up. How long are you staying?" "I don't know yet." Tunde got down from his arms and sat beside him on the bench, swinging his feet that didn't reach the ground. Music. He looked towards the cocoa trees for a moment with that sudden concentration children have when something truly worries them. "Uncle," he said without looking at him. "What? Why can Grandpa no longer go out to see his cows?" Kunle didn't answer immediately. He waited. "My daddy says Grandpa might fall," Tunde continued, still looking at the cocoa trees. "That he's too old and the farm ground is uneven and that it's better for him to stay inside. But," he frowned with that childish seriousness that doesn't know it's being more honest than any adult, "I watch him through the window every day. Grandpa stands by the window and looks at the cows, but he doesn't come out. And sometimes I tap the glass from outside and he sees me and smiles, but he doesn't open the window. My daddy says not to tap it because it excites him and then he doesn't sleep. But Uncle, Grandpa always walked well. I remember he always took me to the corral, walking fast and I had to run to catch up." Kunle looked at his 9-year-old nephew, his school bag still on his back, shoelaces untied, eyes looking at the cocoa trees with a worry that shouldn't exist at that age. "And Grandma?" Kunle asked carefully. "Grandma doesn't come out either." Tunde lowered his voice as if saying something he shouldn't. "Music. My mummy says she's resting. But once, when I went to take her a glass of water that Grandma asked me for, my mummy scolded me and told me not to enter the room without permission, music, and I was just going to take her water." "Uncle," Kunle put his hand on the child's head. "Hey champ, have you had breakfast yet?" Yes. Tunde stood up and adjusted his bag. I'm going to school now. Will you be here when I get back? I'll be here. Tunde ran off down the dirt path towards the road with his shoelaces untied and his bag bouncing. Kunle watched him go until he turned the bend and disappeared among the cocoa trees. Then he looked towards the old barn. Baba Jeed was standing in the doorway of the wooden door with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on Kunle. He had been standing there, Kunle calculated, since before Tunde arrived. He was just waiting for the boy to leave. The barn smelled of old wood and dry fodder. Music, same as always. Kunle entered and closed the door behind him. Light streamed through the cracks in the roof in thin rays that illuminated the dust suspended in the air. Baba Jide was standing next to a pile of sacks with his hat between his two hands, slowly turning it by the brim. The same nervous gesture Kunle had seen him make as a child when something wasn't right on the homestead. Baba Jide, Kunle said. The old man looked up. His eyes were red. Not from sleep. I've been wanting to talk to you for 8 months, Baba Jide said, and his voice came out broken from the beginning, as if the words had been stored too long in too narrow a place. 8 months carrying this. Every morning I would wake up and think, today I'll tell him, today I'll find a way to send him a message. And every morning I found a reason not to. Your wife, Kunle said. It wasn't a question. Baba Jide nodded, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The treatment costs 3,000 naira a month. If Kayode fires me, I have nowhere to turn. He paused for a long time. That doesn't give me the right to have music kept quiet. I know, but I wanted you to understand. I understand, Baba Jid. Tell me everything. The old man spoke for 20 minutes without Kunle interrupting him once. He recounted that it all began almost a year ago, when Folake started receiving visits from a man from the city, dark suit, new SUV, leather briefcase. He came every 2 or 3 weeks, always midweek, always when Pawale was resting and couldn't see him from the window. Baba Jide had seen them walk the north plot, music, the flattest, best for building, measuring with long strides and pointing to the sides. He recounted that it was Folake who arranged everything. Kayode signed the papers. Kayode put the padlocks. Kayode brought the elders their food twice a day, but the instructions always came from her. Baba Jide had overheard her one night through the mud wall. Don't give them music too much, just enough to keep them quiet. As long as the old man doesn't come out and the son doesn't suspect, the deal will close itself. He recounted that the man from the city was called Engineer Kemi Ojo, that a deal was already in place, 200 acres in exchange for a price. Baba Jide didn't know exactly, but had heard mentioned in millions that Folake already had an account in a different bank from the homesteads, where that money would go. She thought of everything, Baba Jid said at the end, in a voice that no longer held tears, only weariness. Your brother does what she tells him since they got married. It was always like that. But this was no longer obeying his wife. This was something else. He fell silent. Then he said what he hadn't been able to say for 8 months. Forgive me, Kunle. Every day I kept quiet, I became a little less of a man. We pause here for a moment to reflect. When someone starts making decisions for others without asking them, when visits become strange and explanations always have an excuse, that's when you need to ask louder, not stay silent. Do you know an elderly person who depends completely on someone else for everything? Are you sure that person is okay? Now, let's continue with the story. Kunle placed his hand on the old man's shoulder and left it there for a moment. You owe me no apology, Baba Jide. Those who owe will pay. He looked at him directly. But I need you to repeat all of that in front of a barrister. Can you do that? Baba Jide squared his shoulders slowly. He put on his hat, nodded once with the same firmness with which he had worked that land for 40 years. Kunle left the barn and dialed a number on his cell phone. Bernard, I need you to come to the homestead. Today. The homestead office was a small room next to the main barn. His father had built it 30 years ago to keep the business accounts. A wooden desk, 2 gray metal filing cabinets, a swivel chair that squeaked as long as Kunle could remember. It smelled of old paper and dry ink. It smelled of decisions. Kunle entered when Kayode was checking the corrals with the farmhands. The only hour of the day he could move freely within the homestead, without his brother suddenly appearing with an overly wide smile. He locked the door, sat at the desk, and opened the first filing cabinet. He started with the top drawer fodder invoices, vet receipts, payroll payment slips, all in order, all dated, all in Kayode's cramped handwriting, which had never been good, nothing out of the ordinary. The second drawer contained a blue folder he didn't remember seeing before. He opened it. Inside was a preliminary sales agreement with a letterhead from a real estate company in Lagos. 4 pages, small print, with the name of the homestead, Adebayo Homestead, 200 acres, Owo, local government area, Ondo State, in the heading. At the bottom of the last page were 2 signatures. One was Kayode Adebayo's music, in his capacity as administrator. The other was engineer Kemi Ojo's, as buyer. The date was 6 months ago. Below the contract was a bank transfer receipt, 2 million naira. Description: advance payment for preliminary sales agreement. The recipient account was not the homestead's. It was an account Kulle didn't recognize. Folake's. He calculated. It had to be. He kept searching. At the bottom of the same drawer, under a red folder, he found what he didn't expect to find, or more accurately, what a part of him had been dreading to find since Babajide told him about the papers. It was a letterhead from a solicitor's office, dated 2 years ago. Title: Power of Attorney for Acts of Administration. And at the bottom of the page, in blue ink and the specific pressure of his own hand, was his signature. Kunle Adebayo, in full use of his faculties, granted his brother Kayode Adebayo broad powers to administer, represent, and manage all assets of the Adebayo homestead, in his name and on behalf of his parents. He remembered the day he signed that paper. Kayode had called him one Tuesday afternoon. He was in the middle of a site inspection in Ikeja, with his hard hat on and the rolled-up plan under his arm. Music. Brother, I need you to send me a power of attorney to process the agricultural insurance loan, or I'll miss the deadline. Kunle had said yes, without thinking twice. It was Kayode. It was his brother. It was the man who had stayed to care for the land while he built houses in the city. He signed the paper that same afternoon and sent it by courier. He never asked what that loan was used for. He never asked for the power of attorney back when the process was over. Never. Kunle placed the paper on the desk and stared at it. His hands, the same hands that had mixed cement, that had carried blocks, that had built 30 years of work, were completely still on the wood. They weren't trembling, but something inside him was. It wasn't fear. It was the specific weight of understanding that he had been, unknowingly, a piece of the mechanism that imprisoned his own parents. He heard a truck enter the homestead by the main path. Bernard had arrived. Kunle collected the contract, the receipt, and the power of attorney. He folded them carefully and left the office with the papers in his hand. Bernard got out of his truck with his black leather briefcase, sunglasses, gray suit completely out of place on an Ondo State homestead, and completely unbothered. They shook hands without long greetings, without questions. Kunle handed him the papers. Bernard read them standing by the truck without sitting down, without taking off his glasses. It took him 4 minutes. When he finished, he remained silent for 10 full seconds, looking at the last page. Then he looked up. "There's a way out," he said, "but it's going to take time to do it properly." Bernard was not a man of circumlocutions. He sat at the desk, opened his briefcase, took out a notebook, and placed the 3 documents on the wood with the precision of someone who has spent 30 years ordering other people's chaos. "The power of attorney is the central problem," he said, without preamble, technically valid, voluntarily granted, dated 2 years ago. Kayode used it to sign the contract with Ojo in his capacity as administrator. That means the preliminary sales agreement has an apparent legal basis. Apparent. Bernard raised a finger. A power of attorney for acts of administration has limits. Selling or committing to sell an immovable property is not an ordinary act of administration. It's an act of dominion. For that, a special, explicit power is needed that says exactly that. The one you signed doesn't say that. Kunle listened without moving. "Music. Then the contract with Ojo is challengeable," he said. "It's challengeable, but there's more." Bernard opened his notebook and began to write as he spoke. "To annul the power and the contract through judicial means, we need to demonstrate that there was an abuse of it, that Kayode used it for a purpose that does not correspond to the one for which it was granted, and that this use caused harm. Babaji's testimony, music, the condition in which you found your parents, the physical conditions of the room, that's the harm. What's missing is establishing intent." "How?" With the timeline, Bernard tapped the transfer receipt with his finger. "This advance from Ojo came in 6 months ago. but I need to know when the first contact between Folake and Ojo occurred. If that contact occurred before your parents were confined to the room, then we have premeditated intent. It wasn't an opportunistic abuse, it was a plan. Kulle thought about what Babajid had told him. The man in the dark suit who came every 2 weeks, the visits to the north plot, the measurements. Music. Babajid says the man from the city started coming almost a year ago, Kulle said. Before my parents were locked up. Bernard looked up from his notebook. Is he willing music to testify to that? He told me yes. Then we have premeditated intent. Bernard closed the notebook with a dry thud. What they did was not impulsive, it was calculated from the beginning. Music. That changes the charges and changes the penalty. They both fell silent for a moment. Outside, the wind moved the cocoa trees with that soft, constant sound. Kulle had heard all his childhood. There's a second path, Kulle said. Bernard looked at him. Music, family. Kulle clasped his hands on the desk. I have an uncle, Chief Dapo. He's the eldest of the Adebayo clan. If he convenes a family meeting, everyone comes without excuses, without pretexts. It's the way big matters have always been resolved in this family, before barristers and before judges. And what do you gain with that you don't gain in court? Kulle took a moment to respond. In court, I gain the land. He said it slowly, as if weighing each word. In the family meeting, I gain something no judge can give me, that every person who bears the Adebayo name knows exactly what Kayode and Folake did, that they hear it from my mouth, face to face, without being able to run away or construct another version. He paused. My father has spent 8 months unable to defend his own land. The least I owe him is for the people who share his name to know the truth. Bernard nodded slowly. Just once. Do both. The meeting first, so they cannot escape afterwards into the family. The court immediately after, so they cannot escape the law. Kulle stood up. He took out his cell phone, dialed a number he hadn't dialed in months. Music. He waited 3 rings. An old, deep voice, the kind that doesn't need to raise its volume to be obeyed, answered on the other side. Hello? Music. Uncle, Kulle said. It's Kulle. I need to ask you a favor I've never asked anyone. Chief Dapo's house was the largest on the neighboring homestead, a mud and stone construction that had stood for 70 years and had seen 4 generations of Adebayos born, married, and die. That night all the lights were on. Kulle arrived first with Bernard and Music Babajide. The others arrived in the next 20 minutes. Uncles, cousins, in-laws, some from villages 2 hours away. Nobody asked what the meeting was about. When Chief Dapo called, you came. It had always been that way, and so it remained. Kayode arrived with Folake at 8 sharp. He entered greeting people with his usual ease. A handshake here, a hug there, suspecting nothing, until he saw Kulle standing next to Chief Dapo, in the center of the room. Then, his smile lasted a second less than normal. Folake didn't smile. She entered, nodded in greeting, and looked for a chair. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, counting faces, calculating positions. Then she sat down with her back straight and her hands clasped in her lap, and didn't move again. Chief Dapo stood at the front when everyone was seated. 75 years old, white hair, hands like the roots of an iroko tree. He didn't need to raise his voice for the entire room to fall silent. This meeting was requested by Kulle, he said. He has something to tell the family. Everyone will listen. No one will interrupt until he finishes. Kulle stood in front of his family. He didn't have papers in his hand. He had memorized them. He had reviewed them 3 nights in a row until every number, every date, every detail was etched where it would not be forgotten. He spoke for 40 minutes. He spoke of the power of attorney signed with blind trust, of the 8 months his parents lived confined in their own rooms while the world continued to turn outside, of the new latch on the window and the plastic chamber pot next to the bed, of the cocoa tree his father looked at every day from inside without being able to go out and touch it, of Babajid, who carried the silence for 8 months because he was afraid of losing his job and couldn't pay for his sick wife's treatment, of the contract with Ojo, of the 2 million naira advance, deposited into an account that was not the homestead's, of the plan that began long before the doors were closed. He spoke without raising his voice, without banging on the table, without pointing fingers. He simply laid out the facts, one by one, like someone building a wall stone by stone, without haste, without embellishment. When he finished, the room was silent. Music. Coyote had his head bowed. He had been like that since the middle of the story. His shoulders moved with breathing he could no longer control. When Kulle stopped speaking, Coyote slowly stood up from the chair and bent over. Not standing, not kneeling halfway. He folded completely with his knees on the ground and his hands on the floor, like someone who could no longer bear the weight of what he carried. "Forgive me, brother," he said with a broken voice. "Forgive me. I know there's no forgiveness, but I ask for it anyway." Kunle looked down at him. There was no hatred on his face, no satisfaction. There was something harder to bear than either. There was the look of a man who understands everything and has nothing left to reclaim of what once was. "You are no longer my brother," Coyote said Kunle. Just that. At that moment, the back door opened. Baba Jide entered first, slowly. Behind him, holding his arm, came Mama Sade, and behind her, walking alone, with short but firm steps, of someone who had decided this was the last thing they would do standing tonight. Pawale entered. The entire room stood up without anyone asking. Pawale walked to the center of the room, looked at Coyote on the floor, looked at him for 3 seconds, the same eternal 3 seconds it had taken him to recognize Kunle that night in the dark room. Then he turned his head and turned his back on his younger son. He sat in the chair someone brought him without saying a word, placed his hands on his knees, and looked straight ahead. The silence that followed was the heaviest Kunle had ever heard. Everyone looked at Folake. She didn't move, didn't cross her arms, didn't look down, didn't press her lips with guilt. She remained seated exactly as she had entered, back straight, hands clasped, eyes forward, as if what had just happened in that room had nothing to do with her. As if Kunle's 40 minutes, Coyote's crying, Pawale's slow steps entering the room were part of a story being told about other people. That was what chilled the room, not her guilt, her absence of guilt. Chief Dapo slowly stood from his chair. 75 years of the Adebayo name, of Ondo soil, of decisions not taken lightly. He walked to the center of the room and stood in front of the two Coyote still on the floor, Folake still seated. "This family," he said in a voice that didn't need volume to fill the room, "built this homestead with their hands, with hunger, with drought, with lean years that still required work. What you two did has no name in any decent language." He paused, looking directly at Folake. "And the worst thing is not what you did. The worst thing is that you don't even regret it." Folake did not respond. Chief Dapo turned to Kunle. "Do what you have to do. The clan is with you." It was at that moment, in the silence that followed those words, that a small voice was heard from the corner of the room. "Grandma." Tunde was sitting in a chair by the wall with his school bag still on his back, because no one had told him to take it off. 9 years old, eyes wide open, not fully understanding what had happened in that room, but feeling, with that specific sensitivity of children, that something big and irreparable had just occurred. Mama Sade went to him and sat beside him. She put her arm around him. "Why is Daddy crying?" Tunde asked in a low voice, looking at Coyote, who was still on the floor with his head bowed. Mama Sade held him close for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes people cry when they realize what they've lost, my son." She said it without bitterness, without harshness, just with the calm of someone who has had a lot of time to think about how to say difficult things. And what is lost like this cannot always be recovered. Tunde nodded slowly, as if that made sense, although he didn't fully understand it. We pause here for a moment to reflect. Coyote and Folake lost the land they wanted to steal. They lost their freedom. They lost the respect of their family. But Tunde also lost, having no fault. The bad decisions of parents always have children who bear their burden. What would you say today to someone who is about to betray their family for money? Now let's continue with the story. 10 minutes later, 2 police officers entered through the main door. Bernard had coordinated them. The report had been filed, arrest warrant signed, the complete file. Everything done through the correct channels, without scandal, without improvisation. Coyote allowed himself to be lifted from the floor without resistance. When the officer put handcuffs on him, he said nothing. He just looked at Kunle once more with the eyes of someone who knows there's nothing to say that will change anything and looked down. Folake stood up alone when asked. She extended her wrists, didn't cry, didn't scream, walked out the door with the same straight back with which she had entered, as if being led out in handcuffs from the family meeting was simply what was next. That, Kunle thought as he watched them leave, that was the most terrifying thing of all. The room fell silent when the door closed. Kunle looked towards the corner. Mama Sade was still sitting with Tunde clinging to her side. The boy was no longer looking at the door. He was looking at his grandmother with that total concentration of children who are storing something forever in their memory. Kunle knew at that moment what he was going to do with that child. Bernard called on Thursday morning. Kunle was on the veranda with coffee when the phone rang. He answered before the second ring. "It's done," Bernard said without greeting. As always, the power of attorney was revoked by judicial resolution. The contract with Ojo is null and void. The judge determined that it exceeded the powers granted, and that there was malicious intent proven by the timeline. Ojo loses the advance and is being investigated for participation in illegal financial transactions. The charges against Kayode and Folake are confirmed. Unlawful detention, aggravated by kinship and victim vulnerability, abuse of trust, fraud, and conspiracy. The initial hearing is in 3 weeks. Kunle listened to everything without interrupting. "The homestead?" he asked when Bernard finished. "The homestead remains in the name of Pawale Adebayo and his heirs. As it always was, no one took it from him." Kunle hung up. He sat there with the coffee in his hand, looking at the cocoa trees for a moment. Then he breathed deeply, a long, complete breath, the kind he hadn't been able to take properly in several days. It was 9 inches the morning when he heard the noise. It was a small noise, the specific creak of his parents' bedroom door opening from inside. Kunle turned his head. Pa Wale was in the doorway, dressed in his usual denim trousers, his usual plaid shirt, the work boots that hadn't touched earth for months. He had dressed himself. Kunle stood up from the bench without saying anything. He walked to his father and stood by his side, not ahead, not behind, exactly by his side. Pa Wale didn't ask for help, didn't extend his arm for support. He just started walking down the veranda towards the main door, with short, careful steps, like someone who is learning again to trust his own legs. They went out to the yard. The morning sun in Ondo State had that specific quality of 9 o'clock horizontal, golden, lengthening the shadows of the cocoa trees to the east like fingers pointing to the hill. Pawale stopped in the center of the yard and closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, like someone receiving something he hadn't received for a long time. Then he kept walking. They crossed the yard, past the barn, opened the wooden gate leading to the first paddock. The cocoa trees were there, the long, even rows, bluish-green under the sun, exactly as Pa Wale had planted them 40 years ago. With the hands that now walked slowly beside him, the old man stopped in the center of the paddock. He bent down slowly, carefully, with the visible effort of someone who is 78 years old and has 8 months of being confined in a room in his bones, and put his hand in the earth. He squeezed it, pulled out a handful of red Ondo soil, and held it for a moment between his fingers, letting it fall slowly through the cracks of his palm. He said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, he did so without looking at Kunle, looking at the hill. "This land smells the same as always." Kunle didn't respond. It wasn't necessary. Both stood in the paddock in silence, with the wind moving the cocoa trees and the sun slowly rising over the bare hills of Ondo State, until they heard quick, small footsteps crossing the yard behind them. Tunde came running with his usual untied shoelaces, his school bag bouncing, his face with that expression of urgency children have when they've found something important to tell. He stopped beside them, looked at his great-grandfather, looked at his uncle, looked at the cocoa trees. Then he stepped between the two, took Pawale's hand with one hand and Kunle's with the other, and stood there looking at the field with the same seriousness with which the two men looked at it. 3 generations on the same land. The breakfast table at the homestead had always been large. His mother had bought it at an artisan fair in Oshogbo 30 years ago, thick Iroko wood, with veins marked like rivers on a map. It had capacity for 12 people, but almost always there had been 4. Now there were 4 again, but different. Mama Sade stood by the hearth, stirring the beans with the same wooden spoon. Kunle remembered from childhood, the one with a crack in the handle that never quite broke. Pawale sat in his usual place, the head of the table facing the door, as he had sat all his life, because he said a man should see who enters his house. Tunde was by his side with a glass of milk in his hand, and his elbows on the table, looking at his great-grandfather with that silent attention he had developed in recent weeks, as if he were storing every gesture, every word, every silence of the old man in a place where it could not be lost. Kunle entered from the veranda with his hands still damp from washing. He sat opposite his father. Mama Sade put the beans in the center of the table, then the eggs, then the pepper sauce, then a basket with handmade bread that was still steaming. She sat at the end, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at the three of them for a moment before saying a silent prayer, as she always did before eating. No one spoke during the first few minutes. It wasn't necessary. Breakfast had its own language. The sound of spoon, the smell of local coffee, the piece of yam pa wale slowly rolled with his fingers because that's how he had eaten it all his life. It was Kunle who broke the silence. I already spoke with the office, he said, without preamble, without preparation, like when one says something that has been ready to come out for days. Rotimi is staying as operational director in Lagos. I am going to manage the projects from here. I have internet, I have a phone, I have a truck. What I don't have here, I don't need. Pawale did not look up from his plate. Mama Sade didn't either. But Kunle saw how his mother's hand paused for a second over the basket of bread before continuing to move. Only a second. Enough. And your house in Lagos? Pawale asked, still looking at his plate. I'll rent it out. Kunle drank his coffee. I'm done building houses for others. I have to fix my own. Pawale looked up. Then he looked at his son. He said nothing, but something in his eyes changed in the same way the sky changes when a large cloud moves away and lets the sun through. Mama Sade took Kunle's coffee cup, added a little more without him asking, and placed it back in front of him. That was all she said. Tunde had been listening with his elbows on the table and his glass of milk half finished. He waited for the silence to settle with that new patience he had learned in recent weeks, that of children who have seen things that force them to grow up a little earlier than expected. Uncle, he said. What, champ? Are you going to live here forever now? Kunle looked at him, looked at his father, looked at his mother, looked out the window at the cocoa trees under the morning sun, the Ondo hills in the background, the red earth. His grandfather had worked before his father, and that his father had worked before him. Forever is a long time, my son, he finally said. But for now, yes, I'm staying. Tunde nodded with the seriousness of 9 years old and returned to his glass of milk. Pawale rolled another piece of yam. Mama Sade served more beans. The hearth was still lit. Outside, the wind moved the cocoa trees with that soft, constant sound Kunle had heard all his childhood and which for 30 years he had missed without realizing he missed it. There are men who build their lives far from where they were born and who spend years convinced that this is correct, that money justifies distance, that sending is the same as being there, that a Monday call replaces sitting at the same table. Kunle Adebayo had been that man. No longer. Land is not worth what it costs. It is worth what one is willing to give up, not to lose it. And sometimes what must be given up is not the land, but the life one built far from it, believing that was enough. Tunde placed his empty glass on the table and looked at Kunle with those dark Adebayo eyes that were already beginning to resemble his great-grandfather's too much. Uncle, he said, will you teach me to count the cocoa trees today? Kunle stood up from the chair, grabbed his hat from the hook by the door, and put it on. Let's go, he told him. But first, tie your shoelaces before we leave. Before we say goodbye, it's worth pausing for a moment, not to repeat what we already know, but to take something from this story that doesn't just remain in words. The first lesson Kunle left us is this. Trust without attention can become the most dangerous weapon, even between blood brothers. Kunle signed a paper without reading it properly, because it was Kayode, because he was his brother, because they had shared a name and land and memories for 40 years. And that signature, given with a clean heart, almost cost him everything. Trusting is not wrong. Trusting without seeing is not right either. The second lesson is harder to hear, but more necessary. Sending money is not the same as being present. 30 years of punctual deposits, 30 years of Monday calls, 30 years of telling oneself that one was fulfilling a duty. And meanwhile, his parents counted the days in a closed room, waiting for someone to open the door. Money reaches an account. A hug does not arrive by transfer. The third lesson is the one Kunle taught everyone without meaning to. True justice is not built with rage. It is built with patience, with evidence, with dignity, with the same firmness with which a man plants cocoa trees knowing that he will not see the fruit immediately, but planting anyway because he trusts the land. Each of these three truths can change something in a family, in a decision, in a call that one has been postponing for months. Kunle Adebayo spent 30 years building things for others, good materials, good structures, buildings that would last decades. He did it with pride, and he did it well. But there is a paradox in the lives of men who build far from home. Sometimes the walls that need the most attention are the ones they left behind, the ones that already know every crack in their surname, the ones that hold inside the smell of local coffee and wet earth after the rain. Mama Sade didn't send him a text message, didn't call crying, didn't ask him to come back with direct words, because she knew that words could be intercepted, misinterpreted, or simply ignored between one meeting and another. She sent him a postcard with shaky handwriting, with 5 words agreed upon 40 years ago on an Ondo veranda, when Kunle was still a child who didn't know that one day he would need that code. The homestead smells different. Sometimes the people we love most send us signals like that, small, discreet, almost invisible, not because they don't want to ask for help, but because they don't know if anyone is still listening carefully enough to understand them. Kunle was listening. And you? This story exists to remind us that family is not what we leave behind when we go out to build our lives. It is what awaits us when we finally return. If these stories give you something to take away, join us every week. Here, there is always one that is worth the time and the heart. Which of the 3 lessons touched you most deeply today? That of trust, that of presence, or that of patience? Write it below with full confidence. Your answer can give strength to someone who is doubting today whether to return home.